This video covers D3 requests. The structure of this video is as follows. JavaScript is single-threaded. Asynchronous IO XML HTTP request, D3 XHR, D3 type-specific requests, and the summary. Alright, let's get started. JavaScript is single-threaded. JavaScript is single-threaded. In computer programming, single threading is the processing of one command at a time. The opposite of single threading is multi-threading. Single threading means the processing of one command at a time, which means that one command is run, then the program waits for it to finish. Once that command is finished, the next command starts. One way to think about it is that the command instructions are in a single line. As soon as one is done, the next one can start doing the work. This works well as long as the command instructions happen in an orderly fashion. Disaster strikes when one process takes a long time or just doesn't return. This breaks the whole system down because the program does not run any more instructions, which means the program stops working. Asynchronous I/O. From Wikipedia, asynchronous I/O, or non-blocking I/O, in computer science, is a form of input-output processing that permits other processing to continue before the transmission has finished. In other words, the asynchronous approach does not have to worry about one command taking a long time because it permits the other commands to start running before the other command finishes. This is especially useful in JavaScript. Because JavaScript is single-threaded, having the ability to do asynchronous function calls makes it less susceptible to slow down in the program. We care about asynchronous I/O because we are dealing with the client and server. So when we use JavaScript on the web browser, we are dealing with a single thread of instructions that may rely in the communication between the client and the server. The classic web application model is a single set of instructions that run as the client and web server communicate with each other. This picture shows how user activity generates data that is transmitted to the server. The server processes this data and sends data back to the client. This happens back and forth over and over again. As we covered earlier, disaster can strike at any point that the client and/or server takes too long to process or do something with the data. From Wikipedia, AJAX, an acronym for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, is a group of interrelated web development techniques used on the client side to create asynchronous web applications. With AJAX, web applications can send data to and retrieve data from a server asynchronously in the background without interfering with the display or behavior of the existing page. AJAX is not a single technology, but a group of technologies. With AJAX, data can be retrieved using the XML/HTTP request object. JavaScript and the XML/HTTP request object provide a method for exchanging data asynchronously between browser and server to avoid full page reloads, which is a huge win because although JavaScript is single-threaded, AJAX allows for the web page to continue loading and performing while data is sent and retrieved from the server. D3 uses this extensively to load the data. XML/HTTP request. XML/HTTP request, or XHR for short, is an API available in web browser scripting languages like JavaScript. It is used to send HTTP and/or HTTPS requests directly to a web browser and load the server response directly back into the script. The data received from the server can be JSON, XML, HTML, or plain text. As we covered before, JavaScript and the XML/HTTP request object provide a method for exchanging data asynchronously between browser and server to avoid full page reloads. So with AJAX, data can be retrieved using the XML/HTTP request object. The HTTP request methods supported by XHR are get, post, head, put, delete, and options. XML/HTTP request objects and how they work are complicated and not entirely relevant for the basics of what we want to do. The basics are that once created, the object will go through a series of states of opening a connection, sending information, ready state when the HTTP content begins loading, and the ready state for when the HTTP content has finished loading. Only after the content has finished loading will the asynchronous JavaScript code proceed. In the case of D3, we'll use the XML/HTTP request to load data from the server. D3 contains a D3.XHR module to simplify the loading and parsing of data. In fact, D3 takes it one step further and even has data type specific methods for accessing data that sits on top of the D3.XHR module. D3 XHR. This is the D3 XHR module. It creates an asynchronous request for the URL passed into it. It has an option to take in a MIME type and a callback JavaScript function. A MIME type is a two-part identifier for file formats on the internet. The MIME type are also sometimes referred to as content types. When we use the D3 data type specific methods, we can ignore setting the MIME type because D3 will make sure the right content type is requested. The callback is the JavaScript function that will be executed when the asynchronous XHR call returns. The XHR call will either result in the resources being loaded or the request will fail. The XHR call will invoke the callback function with two arguments, the error and the data. The error, if it exists, is the error for why the request failed. The data is the actual XML/HTTP request object. If an error occurred, then the data XML/HTTP request object will be undefined. It is here within the callback function that the D3 work that we have been building up to this point takes place. If you take a look at all of the basic D3 data visualizations on the D3.js.org website, you'll see that the actual building of the visualization occurs within the callback code. Next, let's take a look at the convenience methods that D3 provides. D3 type-specific requests. D3 has type-specific XHR functionality to load in data into the browser from a server. This functionality covers text data, JSON data, XML data, HTML data, comma-separated values data, also called CSV, and tab-separated values data, also called TSV. Each type of request has certain features and methods for parsing the data that come in. The D3 text type specific request creates a request for a text file at the specified URL. The D3 text call will either result in the resources being loaded or the request will fail. The D3.text call will invoke the callback function with two arguments, the error and the data. The error, if it exists, is the error for why the request failed, and the data will be undefined. If no error, then the data will contain the response text. The D3 JSON type specific request creates a request for a JSON file at the specified URL. The D3.json call will either result in the resources being loaded or the request will fail. The D3.json call will invoke the callback function with two arguments, the error and the data. The error, if it exists, is the error for why the request failed and the data will be undefined. If no error, then the data will contain the parsed JSON. What this means is that it will take the JavaScript object notation string returned and convert it to a JavaScript JSON object. The D3 XML type-specific request creates a request for an XML file at the specified URL. The D3.xml call will either result in the resources being loaded or the request will fail. The D3.xml call will invoke the callback function with two arguments, the error and the data. The error, if it exists, is the error for why the request failed and the data will be undefined. If no error, then the data will contain the parsed XML. What this means is that it will take the XML string returned and convert it to an XML document. The D3 HTML type-specific request creates a request for an HTML file at the specified URL. The D3.html call will either result in the resources being loaded or the request will fail. The D3.html call will invoke the callback function with two arguments, the error and the data. The error, if it exists, is the error for why the request failed and the data will be undefined. If no error, then the data will contain the parsed HTML. What this means is that it will take the HTML string returned and convert it to an HTML document fragment. The D3 CSV type-specific request creates a request for a comma-separated values file, or CSV, at the specified URL. The D3.CSV call will either result in the resources being loaded or the request will fail. The D3.CSV call will invoke the callback function with two arguments, the error and the data. The error, if it exists, is the error for why the request failed, and the data will be undefined. If no error, then the data will contain an array of parsed rows from the CSV file. This is what it means when D3 takes in a CSV file and parses it into an array of parsed rows. Each array item is a JavaScript object where everything, even numbers, are strings. By parsing it in this way, you can use everything we've learned about arrays of JavaScript objects to use the D3.data functionality. The D3 TSV type-specific request creates a request for a tab-separated values file, or TSV, at the specified URL. Tab-separated values are equivalent to comma-separated values, except the tab character is used as a delimiter rather than the comma. The D3.TSV call will either result in the resources being loaded or the request will fail. The D3.TSV call will invoke the callback function with two arguments, the error and the data. The error, if it exists, is the error for why the request failed, and the data will be undefined. If no error, then the data will contain an array of parsed rows from the TSV file. The TSV parsed rows are the same as the CSV parsed rows. And with that, we have covered the D3 requests. These different requests will let us load large amounts of data easily and seamlessly and let D3 parse the data that is loaded in for us. The requests will be the core of getting D3 data visualizations up and running. The summary. This video covered JavaScript is single-threaded, asynchronous IO, XML HTTP requests, D3 XHR, D3 type-specific requests, and the summary.